Fourth year was the first time someone ever told me they loved me. Oh, Draco, I do love you. Pansy's hand was in mine. Our expensive attire was almost satirical as I twirled her around the icy dance floor. I was caught off guard so severely I almost stepped on the bottom of her pale, floor-length gown. Pansy, I can't... I know. She cut me off. You don't need to tell me, I know. I didn't know if she really knew or whether she was clueless and was just trying to cushion my fragile feelings. But suddenly I felt weirdly choked up, like something had gotten in my eye or I'd accidentally breathed in while sipping on water. Pansy, no, you can't love me, I begged in the tiniest of voices. She smiled sadly. But what isn't there to love? I didn't reply. I didn't think anyone could actually love me. They just loved versions of me. The versions I've spun for them. Versions they've constructed in their minds. The easiest versions of me. The easiest parts of me to love. I glanced over my shoulder as I traversed the winding corridors. Any sign of suspicion, any raised eyebrow, any lingering glance, and I'd stop. Somehow I'd become obsessed by the thought of someone catching me out, their wand raised at my chest as they threatened to have me expelled. I was begging for it, begging for a way out of this dark hole I'd been enveloped by. But no form of misplaced justice ever arrived, even when I was on my knees, crying out to the heavens to end everything right here. Look at me! Watch me as I pretend to feel no pain. Watch me walk to lessons, my eyes glossed over as I failed to pay attention to their endless drones. I crept to the 7th floor with stealth-like agility. The halls were barren and dark, befallen by dark fog upon the castle grounds. There was some crude sense of pathetic fallacy that seemed to coat every morsel of my existence. My thoughts the year prior were so dead set on preventing Umbridge from catching Harry Potter and his club. This year I couldn't even stomach the concept of looking at him. He'd grown even more cruelly handsome. His muscles, outlined by the tightly fitted burgundy sweater that seemed to hug every inch of his upper body with derisive perfection. The polarity between us had only grown. Whilst his body had bulked out, mine seemed to shrink in on itself, tinged grey from a lack of sunlight. His chiselled-out jawline only starkly contrasted my now gaunt-looking features. I had become a shell of myself, walking without the trademark air of smugness that I used to lavish in. Perhaps it was the meals I'd been skipping, or maybe one's body only ever reflected one's state of mentality. I couldn't have guessed. I didn't have room to guess. I paced quietly, 1, 2, and then 3 times. As it always seemed to do, the Room of Requirement's doors greeted me like an old friend. Tonight there was no Crab or Goyle to keep watch for me. If I was honest, I knew they were sick of the polyjuice potion. There were only so many times you can convince a 17-year-old boy to disguise himself as a girl and stand outside a blank wall for hours on end. Even if I could scare them with my dark mark, I felt cruel for being so relentless. The long hours were torturous. Tonight I decided things would be different. I brought with me a new friend concealed within the pocket of my school robe, a small, flightless bird. On the 7th floor was a cage that contained 2 of them, one white and one black. One evening I'd been able to slip one out whilst no one was looking. Its white feathers were soft to the touch. My thumb brushed against its back as I lifted it up to my face, and then I placed it squarely in the centre of the vanishing cabinet, and closed the door without a second thought. Only seconds passed until its quiet chirping ceased to creep through the cracks in the doors. Within moments, silence had incapacitated every inch of the room. I closed my eyes, breathing unevenly. My heart was thudding against my ribcage with trepidation. I felt it in my eardrums, in my neck and wrists too, all the way down to the balls of my feet. My fingers played at the handle of the cabinet until I plucked up the courage to open it once more. Just do it. What's the worst that can happen? I soothed myself. The door creaked open with unnecessary slowness. Then I finally looked inside. In the centre of the floor was the bird, as small as always, yet frighteningly peaceful and unmoving. I poked it with a trembling finger. I urged it to move, but it wouldn't. In fact, it never would again. The bird was dead, curled up on the plywood like a sacrificial lamb laid to rest. And all of a sudden, all the weight of what I had done crashed down on me. And for the first time in my life, I let it all pour out in waves of screams and sobs. Somewhere in my soul, a dam had burst. I kicked a pile of junk, unflinching as it thundered to the ground. My hands cradled my face, attempting to contain my now heaving sobs. All the effort I'd put into concealing every imperfection in my life had unravelled. It was a foreign feeling to release everything so carelessly. I'd learned to push it somewhere deep down, adding it to a pile of other things I'd felt yet never really thought about. But now, years of suppressed tears were boiling in my throat, spilling down my red raw cheeks and entrapping themselves in the lining of my school uniform. I was relentlessly terrified. I hated myself. I hated the fact I killed the bird. I hated my uselessness. I hated my father, who condemned me to this fate by failing his own grueling task. And I most importantly hated the Dark Lord. I'd realized he had ruined every life he ever touched out of the selfishness of his own flawed ambition. He wasn't the leader of men I'd read about in children's books. He was an archaic coward who hid behind the backs of his most loyal servants, who sacrificed their freedom and very existence for his every command. And the worst part of all this was, in part, I actually wanted this. I wanted those around me to cower in fear as I passed. I wanted to be doted on, bowed upon. Selfishly, I'd somewhat felt enthralled at the idea of concealing the dark mark beneath my sleeve. Through my distress, I didn't understand how such a seemingly insignificant thing had triggered such an upheaval. In this moment, it felt like the death of a simple bird was the worst event I'd ever witnessed. Worse than all those years of abuse, worse than the times father threatened to crucio me for not being obedient enough because the Dark Lord would without a second thought. Worse than my unrequited love for that annoying, messy-haired Gryffindor who only seemed to want my downfall. Worse than seeing the port key land on the wet grass, and with it a thud of a lifeless body. In retrospect, there was more to that moment of catharsis. What I hadn't realized was that poor, lifeless bird had symbolized the death of every last morsel of innocence I'd been boyishly holding on to. Up until that point, I still yearned for life to return to normal, for the sun to break through the clouds and bask upon the rolling hills like it had in the years before. But now, I stared at a corpse that once was chirping with life, and my hands were dripping with its invisible blood. I was right back then, in 4th year. Pansy Parkinson could never truly love me, because if she knew my secrets, she'd never look at me the same again. With trembling hands, I clutched onto my wrist. She'd run for the hills if I lifted my sleeve, and it is all my fault.